God's Not Dead was a Christian blockbuster, and it changed the face of Christian movies forever. Before God's Not Dead, the only proper Christian movie series was Left Behind, released in sporadic bursts and then disappearing into hibernation for years. PureFlix Entertainment, the company behind God's Not Dead, made an absolute bundle. $65 million. It may not sound like much next to Captain America or whatever, but for independent Christian studios, it was groundbreaking. Now, though, over a decade on, there are 4 sequels, each one doing worse than the last. I wanted to find the reason for this. Why are Christian audiences abandoning the series iteration by iteration? I believe I found the answer to this question, and indeed, many more that I didn't even know to ask, so let's do some exploring. God's Not Dead is based on a widely misinterpreted quote from my favorite philosopher, Yeehaw Nietzsche, which goes, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water can we use to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" This quote is always reduced to its first line, and it's easy to see why. It's taken by Christians as a jubilant celebration of atheism, but the content suggests something else entirely, that the death of God due to a secularizing society where no one can truly believe anything anymore may bring about an all-encompassing nihilism. Nietzsche thought this was a bad thing insofar as people need to believe in something. His suggestion was called the Übermensch, best translated as Overman, a transcendent figure who could create entirely new values and meanings. Nietzsche was not arguing for atheism or against Christianity, but simply stating a fact. We do have a hard time truly believing anything in the modern world because we are all atomized individuals, increasingly restricted to our own little worlds and bereft of real connection. This is something that leads to nihilism and even cynicism. What bothers a lot of Christians who understand the full quote is the idea that God can no longer be truly believed in at all. The mere fact that Nietzsche pointed to something that they couldn't see and don't want to admit caused anxiety in them, and this is where the movie comes into play. God's Not Dead mostly acts as a lamentation of what is already apparent.
You might want to think about a different instructor.
Gus?
Let's just say you're wandering into the snake pit.
The landscape has changed, and even when Christianity wins on a political level, as in the later God's Not Dead movies, it continues its losing streak, only capable of marking real change on the individual level. There wouldn't be a need for God's Not Dead if what they were doing was working in the first place. All else aside, God's Not Dead is a series that has been on its last legs for a while now. The first movie was a smash hit among Christian audiences. It was a real phenomenon. If you were a Christian at the time, you might have found yourself on a church bus for a showing. If you were outside the church but still knew Christians, they might have sent you a text telling you to see it, as the film suggests at the very end.
All right, now while this next song is playing, I want everyone to go to their contacts and click on everybody you know and text them. 3 simple words. God's not dead.
It was actually some brilliant marketing on their part. We must here remember that as atheists, agnostics, secularists, Christians of non-fundamentalist orientation, and so on, this movie was not for us. This movie was aimed at a primarily fundamentalist Protestant audience, intended to shore up their faith and energize them for the long march through the institutions. And yet, despite this singular focus, we have to remember that from a certain perspective, God's Not Dead actually did a lot of things right. The Christianity of God's Not Dead is essentially non-denominational. Denominations do appear, but the message is one of a vague, broad Christianity that resists a fundamentalist orientation.
You just want to ensnare them in your primitive superstition.
What I want is for them to make their own choice. That's what God wants.
You have no idea how much I'm going to enjoy failing you.
It hints at it, but doesn't openly declare it.
Jesus, that's eternal. Jesus said this, whoever acknowledges me before men, he will acknowledge before the Father in heaven. Whoever disowns me, I'll disown him to the Father. Now, those words are written in red, so they're important.
This is a stroke of genius as it invites non-fundamentalist Christians to partake. Beyond that, there is a clear antagonist, Professor Radisson, an angry atheist who is actually a severely disenfranchised believer.
Why do you hate God?
Because he took everything away from me. Yes, I hate God. All I have for him is hate.
He is someone everyone can dislike because he isn't a pleasant person in any sense. He is something beyond even caricature. As an antagonist, he is the living representation of everything Christians fear. He is a professor, a person of power who has a wide breadth of knowledge that he isn't afraid to use on his Christian students like a cudgel. The protagonist is a young man named Josh Wheaton that takes on Professor Radisson. He is setting out to show that there is an alternative to the godless worldview the professor foists on his students at every possible opportunity.
If you cannot bring yourself to admit that God is dead for the purposes of this class, then you will need to defend the antithesis, that God is not dead, and you'll need to do it in front of this class from the podium.
But he is more than mere protagonist. He is a living folktale because the whole premise of this movie is taken from one. In the original story, no doubt still shared sometimes by your parents on Facebook, a professor asks his class whether God created everything. A student confidently declares the answer to be yes. The two have a back and forth where the student thoroughly humiliates the professor by pointing out the flaws in his logic. At the very end, it is declared that student was Albert Einstein. This story explains how the fundamentalist feels about the world. It is a scary, hostile place in which your faith is constantly being challenged, sometimes very literally, and no one is standing to defend it.
You did it, didn't you?
What?
You know what I'm talking about. You went and did your argument, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
What were you trying to prove? I'm not even sure there are words to describe what I'm feeling right now. I'm sorry, Josh, but it's over between us.
The one person who does, being an example for everyone, is the man whose name is synonymous with genius. Never mind the fact that this story is a fiction. It is inspirational. It tells the fundamentalists not to be afraid because they, too, might walk in the footsteps of genius.
佢好肯定係冇神嘅。
那就簡單啦，上帝不存在。
And that's exactly what Josh Wheaton does. He comes at the professor with doubts about subjects like evolution, sourced from misleading and easily debunkable creationist texts, yet the professor is astonished and can offer only anger.
In the space of just about 90 seconds, most major animal groups suddenly appear in the forms of which they currently hold, not slowly and steadily, as Darwin predicted, but in evolutionary terms, almost instantly.
She died believing a lie. She died believing that someone out there loved her even while he was strangling her to death. A God who would allow that is not worth believing in.
The student body declares that God has won. He is not dead. He is alive.
God is not dead.
God's not dead.
God's not dead. God's not dead. God's not dead.
God's not dead.
God's not dead. God's not dead.
Again, this story is not for us. We are not its target audience. Where you and I sit, the criticisms are endless. It is fundamentalist fear-mongering about the world setting up endless strawmen that are easily knocked down with rudimentary knowledge of science or philosophy. It turns out that there is no atheist in this movie that is explicitly supposed to be about atheism versus God, played out in the classroom. Christianity is sanitized and portrayed as inclusive, but only to a point. Among the converted are a Chinese student, a Muslim student, and the straw atheist Professor Radisson. An African Christian also appears in a bizarre and nonsensical plot that we will be getting to shortly. Conspicuously missing is the one group it would be offensive to show at all, the LGBT community, and I think we can all be glad for that. But the movie doesn't steer clear of issues that might seem divisive, although it usually doesn't go all in on them either. The Chinese student has a father who becomes angry at the mere mention of God, but there are Christians in China. The now ex-Muslim student is thrown out by her grieving father after being found out. Amy Ryan, a left-wing reporter, has a confrontation with one of the Duck Dynasty weirdos about the ethics of hunting. She is obviously wrong, so she gets cancer and converts, like Professor Radisson.
Your results came back positive. You have cancer.
'Drop the statement, please. 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 'Drop the sta
I don't have time for cancer.
I think you're here kind of wondering, kind of hoping that this stuff is for real, aren't you?
How do you know that?
Well, I just felt that that's what God was saying, and He just wanted you to know.
God's Not Dead lacks an understanding of its targets that make the whole affair a strange one if you are one of the targets. Straw atheism, straw leftism, straw Chinese? There is enough straw here to supply every farm in the Midwest 10 times over. This is David A.R. White, Reverend Dave in the film. He is a side character in that nonsensical subplot including the African Christian, Reverend Jude, that I mentioned earlier. The two of them are attempting to go on a journey, and Reverend Jude encourages Reverend Dave to recover his full faith in Christ and asks Christ to take the wheel. Literally. It works.
Unbelievable.
No. Faith.
David A.R. White is more than just a side character, however. He is the founder of PureFlix Entertainment, the studio responsible for the entire God's Not Dead series. While his profile is limited in the first God's Not Dead movie to banter with Reverend Jude and saving Professor Radisson's soul in the end somehow, his profile rises dramatically as he becomes the lead actor on the last 3 films. This was obviously a huge mistake. But we are not there yet, and we will be getting there soon enough. For now, it's putting on the robe time because it's very cold in the UK, and I'm freezing.
If you accept his son and ask him into your life, that's all you have to do is just accept his son. Accept his love and receive his forgiveness right now.
By the time of God's Not Dead 2, Professor Radisson had been vanquished by the hand of an angry god, and Josh Wheaton had continued on with his studies. Meanwhile, Sabrina the Teenage Witch was about to get in trouble in another classroom, and this time the government would be involved.
Isn't that sort of like what Jesus meant when he said that we should love our enemies?
Yes. The writer of the Gospel of Matthew records Jesus as saying, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you will be children of your Father in heaven," which indicates a commitment to nonviolence.
God's Not Dead 2 was still a massive success by independent Christian movie standards. It took in $24 million, under half the total of the first movie, but still pretty incredible. We're talking about a genre that rarely even makes it into theaters at all. The audience wanted to see an escalation. They wanted to see the FBI break down Sabrina's door in the middle of the night, take her kicking and screaming, and sentence her to death by way of a court loaded with Satanists. They wanted to see her spared at the last moment thanks to divine intervention in the form of one man with the legal mind to set her free, Josh Wheaton. And that's exactly what they didn't get. Instead, they got a courtroom drama where the villain wasn't a snarling atheist professor, but some vaguely mean lawyers in suits. A film where the battle wasn't fought with faith and fire, but with legal technicalities and the Bill of Rights.
You know what you won't find in there? No matter how hard you look. The phrase, separation of church and state.
The atheist was no longer the big bad. He was nuanced, human.
Are you a believer?
You mean a Christian? No, but I think that's an advantage.
Why?
You're passionate about what you believe. I mean, let's face it, it's why you're in trouble in the first place. But it blinds you to the realities of procedure.
Okay.
And in doing this, in reaching out to a general audience, in extending the hand of friendship and understanding to people like you and I, the God's Not Dead series put a nail in its own coffin. The very things that we are able to appreciate about this helped kill the series. I'm not saying that God's Not Dead 2 is by any means perfect. It's a stretch to even call this movie decent. And it's easy to understand why fundamentalists were confused. Atheists are no longer pure caricature, but that doesn't mean we are represented accurately. The plot is now muddled and kind of complicated. Now, don't get me wrong, this is obviously way better than being portrayed solely as monsters out to destroy religion, but it's still not fantastic. It's neither red meat for a fundamentalist audience, nor exactly the perfectly extended hand of grace to the rest of us. So, who is this for exactly? Who is this film making happy? My wife has something of a controversial take. This is a movie for women. I kind of see her point. The first movie was replete with male aggression. At every turn, there were angry men reacting angrily, even violently. When they aren't angry, they are still almost the entire focus of that film. There are some women in the plot that drive it forward in some ways, but they're really not that important. God's Not Dead 2 tells a lot of stories about women. It is a woman that sets off the events of the plot by responding to a student's question about Jesus being comparable to Gandhi with a Bible verse. There is a strong focus on her family dynamic and the faith of other women.
You never let anything get to you. How do you do that? Jesus.
The villains, as in the first movie, are indeed angry men.
所以你要跟我对着干。难道你为了这个所谓的上帝要抛弃一切吗？
I'm not sure if this is the most charitable interpretation, either to God's Not Dead 2 or the first one, but there is some measure of truth I can find in it, and it adds to this whole idea that it's kind of unclear what the series is trying to do at this point. I have shared the perspective that the film wants to broaden its appeal, and that seems true, but I don't think this was an overcorrection necessarily. I think it was a creative choice and a calculated choice in equal measure, but it's hard to tell who made these choices. It is essentially the same people behind both movies. If we want to understand where these films went so terribly wrong, we have to understand where this movie, a transitional movie, was coming from. It matters who was in charge. It matters what they thought they were doing. If we understand this, then we understand how a better film on the margins would lead to worse films later on. The side plot involving David A.R. White is essentially a repeat of the first one featuring Reverend Dave and Reverend Jude.
You're back. Why are you back?
My pastor gave me permission to finish my doctorate at Hartley, so if that's okay with you...
It seems redundant. We've already done this. We've already been through this, so why are we doing this again? And I think I know the answer. The success of the first film led to a degree of confidence in David A.R. White's instincts that were probably unwarranted. God's Not Dead 2 had to have another Hercules, and that was Sabrina. We don't know who was behind this decision, but I'm not sure it was a bad one necessarily. Either way, the fact that the Reverend Dave subplot is elevated to being almost the sole subplot in the film signifies something. It signifies that David A.R. White had a lot of social capital and wasn't afraid to use it. And this small change, this favor foisted upon him, would be pivotal for the series. There is no realistic way for Hercules to come back to life or Sabrina to keep falling into trouble. Those plots will be done, but Dave is shown falling into trouble repeatedly. A different kind of trouble to be sure, but the man is unlucky. Something is always happening to Reverend Dave. This sets him up as a bizarre kind of exception to the rules of the series. He himself is an accident waiting to happen, and it will. But let's be honest with ourselves here. The subplot was fun the first time it appeared. It was different. It was kind of funny. There was a message, but that message was silly and whimsical. Jesus will be your mechanic. Literally, he will fix your car. Reverend Dave and Reverend Jude weren't soldiers of God caught up in circumstances beyond their control. They weren't men on a mission. They were just guys. They were just dudes. I can imagine that people probably liked that. And I think that in itself is a big problem. God's Not Dead 2 has a lot of the same posturing as the first. The school is aggressively anti-Christian.
No prayers. No moments of silence.
Really?
Nothing.
It's tradition on the field.
Not on the field, not in the locker room, not in the parking lot for that matter, okay?
The ACLU gets involved.
I know her. She's not gonna go for it.
How do we make this go away and not get blood on our hands?
That's the easy part. We let the ACLU do it.
Ray Wise appears and says,
"We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead."
The main plot is heavy. It's overloaded with information. It's overloaded with villains whose motivations aren't entirely clear. It even takes the bold step of having Sabrina's lawyer be an atheist that is sympathetic to her plight. God's Not Dead 2 was not doing what God's Not Dead is supposed to do. What do you mean atheists can be decent people, sympathetic to people who believe very differently than they do? What do you mean atheists can have feelings that are worthy of consideration and not just condemnation? What do you mean the world isn't purely black and white, divided into easily identifiable camps where you are bad and therefore I am good? There is an incongruence here, a tension between what God's Not Dead 2 wants to be and what it has to be. Are opponents of Christianity merely evil for the sake of being evil, or do they have actual reasons for what they do? Are atheists merely misled sinners doing grave harm to the world, or can they be just regular people trying to make a difference? These types of questions engulf the movie in contradictions. It is a thinking movie, no longer restricted to reaction. It is questioning and forcing its audience to question along with it. But the biggest sin the film commits for any audience isn't any of that. It's that the film is honestly kind of boring. It's toned down significantly. There are arguments, there is scheming, there is unfairness, but it lacks the immediacy and the intensity of the first film. Hercules is not angrily denouncing God anymore. It's all reduced to quiet whispers. The fiery conviction that drove the first film is missing, replaced with a soft and intimate spirituality.
And I turned the corner, and right there in front of me was this church. It had this old sign out front, but it stopped me in my tracks. And the sign said, "Who do you say that I am?"
Who do you think you are? I am! Get it right!
The characters are not fighters, even though they are fighting. Instead, they are martyrs, just patiently waiting for the hammer to fall. When we take a step back and think about God's Not Dead, what is that movie? In God's Not Dead, the main conflict is between Professor Radisson and Josh Wheaton, a student. The power dynamic is there. Josh Wheaton is risking his future to challenge Professor Radisson, but it is still fundamentally an interpersonal conflict. The stakes are limited. It's about the future of Josh Wheaton the individual. Christianity is not on the line. Religious freedom is not on the line. In comparison, God's Not Dead 2 marks a shifting of gears into a conflict that's not entirely about Sabrina the Teenage Witch. There is more going on here. There are real stakes. If this case against her is won, and it made it to the Supreme Court, Christians as a whole may lose out to Ray Wise, brave speaker of the movie title. This shift is a lasting one. The dynamic of the God's Not Dead movies will change forever, and the personal stakes, the meaningful stories, will fall by the wayside. There is nothing wrong with telling these kinds of stories that are about some larger issue, some bigger problem with society. These are the kinds of stories we remember, but to remember them, we have to be interested in them. We have to see ourselves in them. We have to see at least something of the world we live in. As the series becomes more abstract and the issues increasingly inflated, the stakes ever rising, there is no way to relate. The persecution fantasy goes too far even for the believers. There is something interesting about seeing Ray Wise play a lawyer deliberately perverting the facts in ways we expect lawyers to do.
But if you were to ask me a question concerning the Quran, the sacred text of Islam, and I could come up with the answer with great speed and accuracy, and I could quote the proper surah or chapter, then it would be reasonable for you to infer that I was not only a follower of Islam, but that I considered it to be superior to all other forms of religion.
There is something to root for in the upstart lawyer challenging him for notoriety, but not only for that. He believes in something. He believes in the freedoms that you and I believe in. The freedom to think for ourselves and be who we are, even when those things are very different. But do we really see ourselves in two lawyers? Aren't we supposed to be seeing ourselves in Sabrina? And yet, she, the character intended to represent our fears, our hopes, our dreams, and our struggles, is sidelined. Sidelined not just by the lawyers, but by even the side characters. Characters like Reverend Dave, who is seen more and more often, becoming the oracle, the advice giver, a juror in the case. But who do we relate to? Where are we? Beyond that, we have to question what Ray Wise means earlier when he says that he intends to prove that God is dead. What does that mean? How do you do that in a court case about someone merely mentioning Jesus and contextualizing his role in the religion? This is not a case about the existence of God or the divinity of Jesus at all. This is about whether a teacher overstepped her role. But it is blatantly apparent that she did not, even to the most radical atheist. A lot of the audience probably went to see this movie under the assumption that the very existence of God was once more up for debate. In a sense it is, but not in the way the fundamentalists would like it to be. It is a circumstantial part of the argumentation, but not the primary element of it. Even if God is somehow proven real in court, even if Jesus is proven divine, this does not answer the question at hand. How could audiences not be disappointed by this turn of events? When reflecting on the first film, we understand that it represents the expression of a real Christian fear, this idea that children are being deliberately turned into atheists by militant professors. This is an old fear. The Einstein chain email is nothing new. Indeed, if we take it a little bit further, the plot of God's Not Dead 2 should be an extension of this fear. It is a story about God being removed from the schools, but it is an entirely unrealistic expression of that fear. In order for the fear to make sense, it has to be visceral. Instead, the overblown response comes off as melodramatic and therefore inauthentic. It undermines what it is trying to achieve. We can once more talk about Sabrina. She is the one whose life is on the line, and yet we barely hear anything from her for large portions of the film. She is in the background, seen off to the side, if at all. Her voice is strong at the beginning, but is overwhelmed by the nature of the conflict, which may have personal stakes, but is fundamentally impersonal. Court cases are dry, turgid affairs. There is no sense that what is happening really matters to anyone. It's a game they're all playing, and Sabrina is just caught up in it. Think about the TV series Better Call Saul. The stakes are sometimes personal and sometimes sort of impersonal. They hinge on the actions of either a single character or large groups where the only thing to really be gained or lost is money.
We do not let Jimmy win this.
Why would Jimmy even do this? He's a profit participant. This means less money for him.
Because he's a child. He wants his money now. He begged me months ago to settle. You know what he does.
Whatever the truth is, we'll never get back to where we were before mediation. We have to settle.
What the series does especially well is to be found in remembering that between these cases are people. Even during court scenes, there are breaks to refer back to the characters, what they're thinking, how they're feeling, what they expect to happen. God's Not Dead 2 simply does not do this, and it's much weaker for it. In Better Call Saul, we are given an understanding of who these characters are and what motivates them. Jimmy, otherwise known as Saul, wants to be understood, loved, and admired. He wants to make his brother proud, but his flaws shine through with his constant cutting of corners and disregard for social and legal boundaries. Chuck, his brother, is all about protecting the law, which he views as sacred. Understanding Jimmy very well, Chuck tries to stop him from his worst excesses and resents him for how he always seems to get away with it in the end. Kim, Jimmy's friend and later wife, has a primary goal that develops: to protect and help Jimmy. These characters understand each other. These characters know what they're about and who they are and come to terms with themselves and each other, even if in warped ways. We, the audience, come to understand these characters in similarly evolving ways. We know where it is all going because the series is a prequel, but we become invested in it all the same. Better Call Saul gives the audience something to believe in, even when we know we shouldn't. God's Not Dead 2 is a movie, not a series, so we obviously are not going to be able to develop characters in the same way, but character development isn't impossible even here. This is a 2-hour-long movie, and they have the space to do that, but they just don't. They refuse. They allow characters to stand as they are, hollow shells, motivated by nebulous unknowns. This is a problem in Christian media more broadly, but it is especially pronounced here. In the film, they set out to prove that Jesus is a historical figure, someone that actually existed and something that practically no serious person denies. It is another digression that has nothing to do with the actual issue. Whether Jesus is a historical figure or not has little to do with the fact that he is still a religious figure. We can all probably agree that simply explaining the role of Jesus as a peacemaker similar to Gandhi or Martin Luther King is not a serious transgression of secularism, whether Jesus was real or not. That should not be the focus of the argument. This is something all of us can probably agree on, but instead they treat it as the pivotal argument. They use Lee Strobel, author of The Case for Christ, as a witness to prove the reality of Jesus and, further still, his resurrection. I did a 4-part series completely dismantling the arguments that Lee Strobel uses, so seeing him pop up on screen was practically a jump scare. Lee Strobel is not a serious apologist. His Case for Christ is one of the weakest exercises I have ever seen. I don't say this lightly. I am on YouTube, after all. I have seen some terrible apologetics.
Here is an awesome fact. Atheists
believe in God.
So Lee Strobel does his thing, and without someone knowledgeable enough to balance it, he comes off as heroic.
We can prove the existence of Jesus solely by using sources that have absolutely no sympathy toward Christianity.
But almost any argument can appear strong if it is the only one given a fair shake. Now, I understand that they have to do this. I understand that they cannot include knowledgeable scholars of Christian history. This is a propaganda film, and they have taken a side that must win. In order to enable this victory, all dissent must appear weak.
No questions, Your Honor.
That's lunch.
Ray Wise, who appears incredibly knowledgeable about a wide range of subjects, suddenly falters. He cannot be allowed to respond as confidently to Lee Strobel as he should be able to. Lee Strobel has to mystify him. It is his purpose. We understand that God's Not Dead, taken as a whole, has a different view of the world than we do. But there is another disconnect here. We understand the world of God's Not Dead. We understand the worldview that is behind it. We know the arguments. We know which ones are stronger and which ones are weaker. But they don't know us nearly as well as we know them. They are not allowed to, because understanding us would mean accepting that we could have a point, and that means we could be right. This is a compromise in worldview that the fundamentalist cannot stomach. This level of uncertainty, this cognitive dissonance, forces them into a box of their own construction. If the truth of Christianity were really as self-evident from the historical record as God's Not Dead suggests, there would be no need for such films in the first place. If Lee Strobel were really as compelling as they make him seem in isolation, he would not be known mostly for preaching to the choir. He would be a sensation. These exercises serve to make the apologetic arguments for Christianity seem incredibly strong precisely because they are the exact opposite. No serious thinker takes Lee Strobel seriously because his arguments are laughable if you understand the subject. God's Not Dead cannot be allowed to reckon with this on any level. God's Not Dead 2 sees Lee Strobel and those like him in a certain light, that being he is a proper thinker, a real philosopher which the mainstream unfairly ignores. He and people like him must be heard, but this is simply not the case. Lee Strobel has been heard by the mainstream, and when he has, it has not worked out in his favor. The film wants him recognized for the genius apologist that he is. That is their version of fairness, a version that is beyond questioning because what is right is self-evidently right. They presuppose their correctness and set out to prove only that. God's Not Dead does not set out to answer the question of what is true, but rather how can we most effectively show that Christianity is true. We know what they are doing. We know this is the purpose, but do they know? Have they reckoned with the fact that this is an exercise in propaganda and therefore selective reasoning? Or are they blind to the reality that they are losing the fight for good reason, that their opponents aren't just evil, but potentially correct? If a worldview is built on the idea of absolute certainty that you are correct because you know you are, there is good reason to look away. There is good reason to not understand the ways in which you are failing. But in doing so, you are repeating the same mistakes over and over. The truth is that there are decent apologetics out there, but there are also great replies to those apologetics. It is perfectly fine to have a starting point in your thought process. We all do. But if that starting point is also the predefined ending point regardless, then your thinking is an exercise in confirmation bias, not reasoning. An honest debate of these issues would result in a stalemate situation where both parties essentially agree to disagree. We see this all the time. Depending on how the case is argued and the composition of the audience, people may lean towards one view or another. Some of this may be on strength of the arguments, or they may be just personal bias. One thing it can never result in is a unanimous victory for a side. Trying to materialize this scenario ultimately removes it from any semblance of what is real. In the second hour of the movie, Reverend Dave's prominence increases further. He is issued a subpoena and has to bring a copy of every sermon from the last year to prove he has no bias. He refuses, but this subplot adds to the idea of government intervention in Christian faith writ large.
I know it's unusual for a Christian pastor to willfully resist a subpoena issued by a lawful government authority. And it's even more unusual that he should feel compelled to do so.
Are you sure you want to do that?
Something that I have to do.
Then he gets appendicitis.
Juror number 12, is there something you'd like to say?
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Whatever else can be said about Reverend Dave, in God's Not Dead 2, he certainly has a way of stealing the show. We have at this point seen more of Reverend Dave than we have of Sabrina. You know, the person whose life and career are actually on the line. The development of the plot is now firmly in a call-and-response pattern with Reverend Dave. Nevertheless, after Lee Strobel makes an exit, J. Wallace Willoughby of Cold Case Christianity makes an appearance. He tells his usual shtick. I was a famous investigator and I humbly solved really important cold cases.
Yes, I applied my expertise to the death of Jesus at the hands of the Romans, and I actually looked at the Gospels as I would any other set of forensic statements.
As I have shown in another video, this is an exaggeration. J. Willis Wimbo was apparently a perfectly fine detective, but he is known primarily for apologetics.
I'm not a Christian because I was raised that way, or because I hoped it would satisfy some need or accomplish some goal. I'm simply a Christian because it's evidentially true.
One has to imagine there's a reason for that. Furthermore, what happened to Jesus is not exactly the same as a cold case. It is a historical and theological matter that he is unqualified to take on from a scholarship perspective. He has no training. If I am an excellent plumber, that's really cool, but it doesn't make me an expert in the hydrodynamics of flowing lava. That is another field entirely. There's a larger problem with using so-called expert witnesses like Lee Strobel and J. Warby Williams, who are experts in, respectively, nothing at all and crime. While these arguments sound rhetorically strong in brief, the lack of meaningful questioning leaves them essentially toothless.
But isn't it true that these gospel accounts vary widely in what they say? That there are numerous discrepancies between these accounts?
Absolutely, but that's exactly what we should expect.
I don't quite understand that.
They are there, but they are only there. They serve the narrative of the film, and little besides, and we do not have sufficient reason to be invested in this narrative in the first place. Between the testimonies and the result of the trial, there is an overflowing sentimentality dripping from every single second. Some kids from the school get together and sing How Great Thou Art to a weepy-looking Sabrina.
Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee.
Reverend Dave and Reverend Jude meet up in the hospital, and Reverend Dave says the jury needs him, showing that characteristic David A.R. White humbleness.
Now I understand what it is you weren't allowed to talk about.
I wish I still wasn't allowed to talk about it. She needs me on that jury.
Then, the Chinese student, Martin Yip, comes in to tell Reverend Dave that he wants to be just like Dave when he grows up. Surprisingly enough, that's not a joke.
I believe God wants me to be a minister, to return to my country and become a pastor, just like you.
That's great.
Sabrina's lawyer tries a novel strategy of badgering the hell out of his client on the stand, confusing everyone. Has he gone rogue? Has the evil inside finally emerged? Will this shocking conclusion lead to the conviction of Sabrina and the end of Christianity? No. Instead, she just confesses her faith, and he goes on this devil's advocate tirade about banning Christians from schools in the name of tolerance and diversity, because of course he does.
In the name of tolerance and diversity, I say we destroy her.
That's enough, Miss Emily.
Then we can all go to our graves content, knowing that we stomped out the last spark of faith that was ever exhibited in the public square.
Ray Wise doesn't even bother with closing remarks or challenging the narrative.
Remind me to send him a thank you note.
What is obvious to you and I, that the atheist lawyer just made his client's case much stronger, is apparently totally lost on Ray Wise. It's a forest for the trees situation. The lawyer demanded his own client be convicted, and that's enough. But it's not. It's blatantly apparent that he was daring them to set precedent for banning the very existence of people of faith from public life. It's a sleazy tactic, and surprise, surprise, it works.
We, the jury, find in favor of Grace Wesley.
The film tries to create a sense of jubilance amidst this triumph, but it doesn't really land. The performances are too put on. It really seems like as the film was nearing completion, everyone was too tired to even pretend. It's a happy ending with no happy ending. Sabrina is justified. The Newsboys appear to do a song, just like in the first movie, but it's much less catchy and fun than in the original. Nothing works. Everything they try to do fails, so God's not dead. Once again, Even so, the lower box office returns for God's Not Dead 2 suggested audiences wanted something else. God's Not Dead 1 and 2 had earned enough money to jettison the niche D-list 90s celebrities and shoot for the moon. The new superstar lead for God's Not Dead 3 would be Josh David A.R. White. God's Not Dead 3, this time with a title, A Light in Darkness. In music, there is the concept of a band's third album usually being a dud. The fourth one may be pretty good, but by the time a band reaches the third album, they've usually run out of ideas. The first one formed the sound, the second one elaborated on that sound and introduced experimental elements, and the third one went a little bit too far with the experiments, or sometimes an important member of the band, like the key songwriter, left between the second and the third. God's Not Dead 3, while not an album, is a mix of these problems. The success of the first movie warranted a budget increase to the second movie, but they couldn't find a lead as captivating as Hercules, nor a narrative quite as pressing as Professor versus Student. The second movie introduced a lot of experiment and nuance that didn't really go the whole way. It began to elevate a character that was kind of charming in the first movie, but became too self-important in the second. For these changes, and the general lack of conviction, it suffered greatly at the box office. But one man's trash is another man's treasure, and David A.R. White loves his trash. He finally decided to ignore the financiers, the audience, and the very idea of good taste to become a star. This was a mistake. David A.R. White's character, Reverend Dave, comes off as not much of a character at all. He is a generic hip youth pastor, and those are kind of hit and miss. When they hit, they can run popular megachurches in Los Angeles that attract the likes of Justin Bieber. When they miss, they usually turn into small-scale cults. Luckily for us, David A.R. White is not charismatic or compelling enough for the stage, but he does own an entire entertainment company with a big profile in Christian media. The company is, of course, spearheaded by a series that was, at least for a moment in time, wildly profitable. God's Not Dead is, in essence, his series. This was his time to shine and bring God's Not Dead back to what it was always meant to be, a complete, unabashed disaster. God's Not Dead 3 tries its hand at something novel for the series, cinema. It begins with a crackling fire and a narration from a woman I don't recognize at all.
Sometimes all it takes is a spark. Something very small. But the spark becomes a flame, and if that flame spreads, power can be so overwhelming it transforms everything around it.
Then we cut to a shot of Reverend Dave in a jail cell. It turns out he stole this idea from the last film, but one sadly cannot go to jail for that. Instead, he is apparently in jail for refusing to hand over sermons in which he knowingly violated the law.
Hill refused to abide by a controversial government mandate to turn over transcripts of his sermons to city officials.
A more perfect example of the Christian persecution complex could scarcely be found. I cannot overstate just how much literally no one wanted this. I cannot overstate how much even the intro of this movie is a red herring for the actual plot. There is no amount of overstatement that is sufficient for God's Not Dead 3. I believe the single best piece of evidence that I am right is the fact that this movie was a box office bomb with a 75% loss film over film. Where the second movie has a plot of at least some kind, this movie has a plot that not even the most delicate squint can possibly reveal. Like Patrick Bateman, it has all of the appearances, but it simply is not there. Not content with merely being the hero and icon that he already is to Martin Yip, somehow Reverend Dave decides he and Reverend Jude should run into their now burning church so that Dave can save the day once more. Reverend Jude fucking dies. He just fucking dies. This was a completely avoidable situation. What are you doing, Reverend Dave? Why did you kill your best friend, the one black man you're friends with? Is Reverend Dave racist? 12 hours earlier, some woman dives into a pool. I don't know why we're going to that. Someone just died. Show some respect. But here we are, now following the story of a woman who's really going through it, but at least she's alive. And also having some sort of faith crisis.
I'm starting to feel pretty dumb talking to myself when you don't talk back, so...
Who can blame her with all that's happened in... oh god, the first 11 minutes of the movie. It turns out her faith crisis is especially bad because her parents are religious. She's sitting in the library now and gets a phone call from her mom. She ignores it, and her boyfriend or whatever asks why she didn't answer it before correcting himself.
My parents would be devastated if they found out I was even questioning.
That's right, she's deconstructing, and the boyfriend is an atheist, selfishly trying to help her feel better.
I did my time as a kid, remember? I just got out sooner than you did.
Okay, can we not talk about this?
Sure.
In the next scene, she's hanging out with a group of atheists, having the usual Sunday atheist meeting that atheists have, apparently.
And if we get lucky, maybe we'll collide with the reality where our school isn't poisoned by Reverend Dave and his one truth.
Preach it.
You just don't get it because you're one of them, okay?
They're kind of rude, which means it's breakup time. Sorry, loser boyfriend. You've pushed this woman we don't even know too far this time.
I think I just need some time right now. On my own.
And that was just a really weird display all around. I don't understand this subplot. We can hear her thoughts. She tells us pretty directly that she is deconstructing and doesn't even really believe in God anymore, but she gets mad every time her boyfriend brings it up, which is twice. He doesn't even seem like a bad guy, just kind of stupid. He tries to apologize, but that's not good enough.
I'm so tired of having this same conversation over and over again.
Yeah, me too. I'm sorry.
Sorry, bro, the God thing is an impassable barrier for this woman that didn't even believe in God anymore 35 seconds ago. She goes to see David A.R. Josh Wheaton. That's right, he's back, and she's pretty obviously crushing on him within seconds of even laying eyes on him. And he is every bit as confused about this situation as we are. It goes nowhere. I apologize deeply, but I do have to share something serious here. This is a big flaw I've noticed over and over in these types of movies. There is a spontaneous romance that blooms from literally nothing. There is no lead-in, expectation, nothing. It wasn't there, and now it is there. And okay, I'll admit this does happen in real life, but that's not why these films do it like they do. Their reasons are different, special even. They simply cannot show anything unsavory like two people that just met passionately kissing against a wall. No, that would be immoral, not family friendly, but a man burning to death? Oh hell yeah, put that shit on. And I know some detractor is going to come along and say, but wait, Reverend Jude died of smoke inhalation or something. He didn't actually burn to death. And sure, that's a good point, but this does happen sometimes in Christian movies. The Trump prophecies, for example, does feature exactly that happening, and I'm pretty sure more than once. The big reveal, as it were, is that the atheist boyfriend burned down the church in a moment of anger. Religion did this to him, and this one action will make it better, and I question this writing decision. I know that's not a strong statement in general when it comes to the God's Not Dead series, full to the brim, as it is with bad writing decisions, but this one hits different. They used a weird and contradictory romance subplot to explain the death of the one good character in the whole series. I guess just about the most dangerous thing to a character's future in the God's Not Dead universe is trying to share the spotlight with David A.R. White. I don't think the God's Not Dead series really knows what it's doing. This shouldn't be a staggering revelation to anyone that's been following the 7,000 words I've spoken for us to reach this point, but it is to me. It's a staggering revelation because to this point, the series had made $80 million. That's 80 million chances to spend money, better than what we've had to this point. That's 80 million reasons to cast someone else as lead, anyone else. 80 million reasons, and they choose this, a paycheck for David A.R. White. And Ted McGinley for some reason. Oh yeah, he's in this. I don't think he fully knows what he's doing in it either. He is vaguely sympathetic to the church, and I just realized I haven't even explained the plot. That's because they haven't actually made it very clear. The church has apparently been causing problems for the campus it is on for years. It's controversial, and the higher-ups at the campus want it gone. The fire is the perfect excuse to get rid of it.
The church has brought nothing but controversy to the school for years. It's time.
Our enrollment is down 18%. We stand to lose $15 million this year alone.
I'm well aware of that, but we can't pin all of this on St. James.
What does this have to do with the sermons thing at the start? I have no earthly idea. Why did they just do that and never explain it? We are 30 minutes into this hulking monstrosity, and all we know is that the campus doesn't like the church and wants it gone. We don't have a clear sense for what the controversy even was yet. What did they do at this church? What skeletons, literal or otherwise, are they hiding in that basement? Do we ever find out? No! Reverend Dave appeals to his brother for help. His brother Pierce is a lawyer.
Hey, look, this is a property law case. It's not really my thing.
Pierce, you're a social justice attorney. They're forcing us out because we're a church. This is exactly your thing.
He's also awesome, and it makes you wonder what went wrong with Dave other than being played by David A.R. White. But maybe that's the wholeness of the problem. A boring, unremarkable man who plays himself. But I digress. After first arriving at Dave's house, Pierce asks for alcohol, which Dave obviously does not have.
Got booze?
No.
The two of them banter back and forth about this and that, and we start to find out more about their relationship. It doesn't seem great.
What happened?
Triple bypass.
Heart surgery? You had heart surgery.
6 years ago.
I had no idea.
Why would you?
All else aside, I think Pierce benefits greatly from having a really good actor. You really get a sense for how tired he is of Dave. He has his first, oh God, moment within seconds of reconnecting.
God called me to fight. I'm gonna fight.
God calls you, you call me.
This man may not even be acting. This man is us. All of us. Finally, someone to relate to. The strangest thing about God's Not Dead 3 from where I stand is that Reverend Dave seems tired. This is his movie, his story, his show. He finally has the reins, and he has no idea what to do with it except kill his best friend and mope around about it. That's human, of course. I'm not questioning that, but it's an odd thing to do in a movie, especially one that has framed itself as an actual cinematic experience, at least compared to the first two. This movie is titled A Light in Darkness, but as far as I can tell, there is only darkness, a living void that is Reverend Dave. God's Not Dead 3 has fallen into a deep well of sadness that it is having a difficult time escaping. It is trapped in the orbit of malaise, a malaise seemingly without source. Remember, this was made in 2018 during the Trump administration, a time when fundamentalists were ecstatic. Where is that energy? I've said it a lot, and I'm sure I'll say it again. This is not what the audience wanted. They wanted a sense of triumphalism. They wanted to believe that they are winning at this moment, so why is everything so dark? If we hang on this subject for just a second longer, I think the reason is hidden in a scene where the brothers have a little bit of good old-fashioned discourse.
Church has outlived its usefulness.
Wow. Well, church is a place for people to seek, to grapple with those difficult questions, to find hope and truth. And you know that. Or at least you used to.
Why do you need me to agree with you about everything? I'm just your lawyer.
The Trump administration may have soothed over some of their anxieties over the political state of the nation, but it doesn't entirely speak to the soul. A lot of fundamentalists have convinced themselves that it does, the QAnon types for example, but does it really? The answer is kind of mixed. Trump supported Christianity and is doing it more openly now during his second term, but will that turn the tide? This is a moment of doubt shining through even in a time of excitement. There is a sense that, at least from the perspective of the filmmakers, Trump is not enough. A political movement can't solve a problem that is spiritual. This is, of course, another message the audience absolutely does not want to hear. Whether they believe it or not, they want to think that the election of this leader or that leader represents the turning of the tide back to a Christian nation. But God's Not Dead 3 flops down on the couch and says, no. In other words, this movie is a reflection of a deep anxiety it is incapable of fully expressing or even potentially understanding. It reveals the underlying psyche of this franchise, one that is not just of this franchise, but the entire Christian enterprise. Its thirst can never be quenched, its hunger sated, and even the barest hint of satisfaction makes it deeply unsatisfied. Then, Ted McGinley comes and beats the shit out of Reverend Dave. I guess one good thing about this film is that we get to see a very different side of Reverend Dave. The side where he continues getting beaten up on in new and exciting ways on a near-daily basis.
Well, it's kind of my signature move.
After this, he attacks the kid who burned down the church and blames him for Reverend Jude's death, but let's be honest here. If you run into a burning building and drag someone else with you for no actual reason, I don't think you can really blame anyone else for that decision. Josh Wheaton appears and does something that has already been done in the series, but that annoys me every time they do it anyway. He says it's good to ask difficult questions, and that's an unironically good opinion, but then he goes and ruins it by qualifying it, saying God can use that.
At the time, I'd never even considered that God could be dead. But now...
It's okay, Keaton. It's good to ask difficult questions. God can use it.
If the question is one of God's very existence, bookending it with "God can use that" is not exactly much of a comfort. It sort of tells the listener, you can question, but only this far, you know? Like, there is a limit to how far you can go, and if you think you're going to conclude there is no God, then you're just wrong. You can't go there. Sorry. Nuh-uh. That's too far. I won't let you. In these movies, not just the God's Not Dead movies, but Christian movies more broadly, doubt is always a test and never a process. It isn't something to fully engage in and with. Doubt is not the cornerstone of great philosophy. It's never leading to something better. It's only God making you wonder, for funsies. Why is he doing that? Why does he want to dangle this carrot in front of your face, but never actually let you get at it? Why is your intellect only something to test you, lest you embrace it and be misled instead? These are questions that are never asked because they're irrelevant to the movie's purpose. What is relevant is the conflict between the two brothers, which is actually really interesting and awesome. They've been escalating their arguments for most of the time they've been together, and they both kind of suck. Ultimately, I think we have to give the most leeway to Pierce. He sees himself having been forced out of the family for his intellect. He sees Reverend Dave as having betrayed him for reasons that he can't really connect.
You forgave me. For what exactly? For leaving? You forced me out, you and Mom and Dad, all you.
Break. No one forced you
Oh,
out.
yes, you did. I wasn't welcome in this house once I started asking tough questions.
Is that what they were? Tough questions? Oh, why did God allow bad things to happen to good people?
Reverend Dave likewise has all these weird assumptions about what it all means and also feels betrayed, despite the fact that he got to stay right where he was.
I guess your Christian roots were too provincial.
Well, at least I know what's happening in the world 5 miles outside the county line.
You're right, I don't know. And I don't know why you left me to take care of Mom and Dad when they were sick. Why did you leave me to take care of everything after they were gone? Do you have any idea what you did to Mom and Dad? You broke their hearts.
You're the one that broke my heart.
It's good to explore these kinds of relationship dynamics, and I think we can all appreciate that. There is something of an attempt to come to terms with serious differences in worldviews and approach to existence itself, and it feels real. It isn't like a lot of the other atheist and Christian relationships we've seen in the whole series and even in this movie. It feels honest and genuine, and I like that. There should have been more of that. But these guys are acting kind of ridiculous. Their unresolved conflicts come out in silly ways when they could probably just talk about it more like they did earlier. I know that's not always how it works, but it's not like Pierce is unreasonable or Dave particularly uncharitable. They both have a lot of flaws, and those flaws come out in different ways, but they're capable of this. We've seen them do it already. And when I said it's relevant, I mean it's relevant because it's about more than two brothers who can't decide whether they love or hate each other. It's about these two wrestling with the very questions this movie is too afraid to ask in the more candid moments. The questions that all of us wrestle with throughout our lives that are not foreign to anyone, Christian or atheist or anything else. These questions define our lives, and we shouldn't have to be afraid of them, no matter what our answers are. But the movie can't just say that, until it does.
You didn't take the time to understand what I was going through. I was trying to sort out my own faith, my own sense of God. I was changing, and you all hated me for it, and that's the truth, David.
We are left after this scene with the question, what does this movie really want to say? And I think that's actually easy to answer. This movie, in wrestling and wrangling with its contradictions and the contradictions of the time it was made in, essentially wants us to stop fighting. Not because nothing is important or valuable, not because nothing is meaningful or worth defending, but because we're destroying ourselves in fighting over things we can't even understand fully. But there is a more cynical part of me that thinks this message is somewhat misleading because it leaves out some crucial details. This movie casts the Reverend as initially leading protests and legal wrangling, and it places him as the problem, but his change of heart as the solution.
There's going to be a big protest tonight at the church. Town's on edge, the whole thing's gone too far.
Didn't have to.
You're right, and I'm sorry. I truly am, for everything.
Me too.
And yet the subtext is still there, this nebulous feeling that there is something else going on. This is expressed in the atheist group who arranged protests against the church, and then came to the conclusion that Reverend Dave was legit after he gave up.
Call it a publicity stunt if you want, but we were there. I mean, this dude's legit. He would have won He could have given Hadley the finger, but he handed it back. He cares more about this community than winning. I believe that.
Basically, I don't hate this ending. I think the message is good, but I also think it was probably defined by the time in which it was filmed. You have to remember that in 2018, the Trump administration still had liberals on edge. There were protests and marches all over the place over any number of issues. Left-wing firebrands like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were rising up from the ashes of the establishment's hard loss in 2016. Considering this, it's hard to say whether the desire for unity was out of a genuine sense of duty to the fellow men, or merely a reactionary response to an underlying fear. I'm an optimist. I want to believe that someone saw the error of their ways and decided everything had gone too far and it was time to turn it around before it was too late. I want to believe that it wasn't just a statement they believed was necessary because they might lose. I want to believe that, but I don't know if I do. So, after years of diminishing box office returns, it seemed like PureFlix was ready to take a bold new direction for the fourth film in the franchise. They had learned from their mistakes and were ready to move on. No more misses, no more wasted opportunities. The future was bright and the series needed a new star, and that star would be Josh David A.R. White. Again. God's Not Dead 4, give me, Lord, how many of these things are there? I have to admit that I have not seen God's Not Dead 4 before. I've heard about the plot through other creators like Big Joel, but I have yet to see the horror myself. In the first few minutes, we get a Reagan speech about freedom, which is pretty ironic. I mean, not just for the fact that it's Reagan, but for the fact that none of these movies have in any way involved somebody actually losing freedom.
You and I have lived too long with this miracle to properly be appreciative. Freedom is a fragile thing, and it's never more than one generation away from extinction.
Neither does this one. The righteous Christians always win in one way or another. There isn't even a proper villain in the third one, only the Love Boat guy, who is a friend of Reverend Dave's and therefore sympathetic to his plight. Even the Sunday Atheist Club comes around thinking Reverend Dave is a cool dude now because he stopped being a dick. Everyone else, of course, is actually oppressed.
I don't think I can return.
Why?
The persecution of people of faith is much worse now than when I left. And not just of Christians, but of Uyghur Muslims and others.
And I heard they're trying to detain millions in re-education camps.
Oh, now they're trying to contextualize the Bible to make it more culturally appropriate.
Why aren't we putting more emphasis on those stories? You know, the stories that actually matter. Why does everything have to be about Reverend Dave? Who is this man that always finds himself in the middle of every problem the church faces? Who is this man? The proper name of God's Not Dead 4, so we don't dead name it, is God's Not Dead, We the People. You get the feeling that you're about to watch a grand epic where a lot is on the line. Finally, a movie worthy of the premise of the series. Unfortunately, audiences seem to have disagreed. This movie made a paltry $1.1 million. If you're keeping track, that's 1/8 the original movie, which was 1/4 the movie before that, which was, in turn, 1/3 the movie before that. It turns out that we the people want to see something better than what this movie is about to be. Why not tell a story involving the struggles of Christians around the world who are actual victims of oppression for their faith? Why not take a bold new direction where African Christians in a hostile country are fighting for their very lives? Why not? Because David A.R. Look, I get it. This is a film for white Christian audiences, and that's a really big leap. But remember, these are people worshipping a 2,000-year-old Jewish man from modern-day Palestine, or what's left of it. There have been real stories about faith in the midst of oppression, actual oppression, and they have been great. People may like them, even people you don't expect to. Let me give a real example. There is a 2005 movie called Shooting Dogs, released in the US as Beyond the Gates, which is about the Rwandan genocide. It isn't a Christian oppression story in the meta sense because it is about something much larger, a conflict between races that sprang up as a result of imperialist favoritism. But at the same time, it does have a Christian subplot that is incredibly touching and important. It's got Will Graham from the TV version of Hannibal and Joan-Hart from almost everything, and on top of that, it received rave reviews for its handling of the conflict and religious undertones. As people are evacuating, Will Graham has a crisis of faith and goes to Joan-Hart, the priest, to ask where God is in all of this, leading to this beautiful exchange.
You ask me, Joe, where is God in everything that is happening here and all this suffering? I know exactly where he is. He's right here. With these people suffering. His love is here. more intense and profound than I have ever felt. And my heart is here, Jack.
It's not preachy, but it's not a whisper either. It's an intimate moment between two people choosing very different paths. One whose path leads to safety, and the other whose path leads to being counted among the victims. You can probably guess which one is which. This is the depth and subtlety that is missing in God's Not Dead, but which is sorely needed. Moreover, Beyond the Gates, or whatever you want to call it, was made with the input of survivors of the genocide. This is not a movie that pulls punches. It is visceral, it is real, and it is based on the lived experiences of people who suffered actual oppression. Sometimes, although it is not the main plot point, people suffered not because of their race, but because their faith inspired them to take action to save other people. And that's powerful. What I'm saying is, the God's Not Dead series has been thinking far too small for a long time. I know for a fact that this one follows suit even though I haven't seen it because I know what it's about. We the People is about a homeschooling conflict. It's like having a movie called World War III, The Ultimate Showdown, and it's about two men arguing over a parking spot. Actually, somebody should make that. Anyway, while the last film in the series included an incredible line about Jesus being a social justice warrior...
Jesus was the ultimate social justice warrior.
This film includes someone identifying as self-partnered?
Is Miss short for Miss or Mrs.?
It's not short for anything. It's complete by itself.
Oh, she meant no disrespect. She's just asking if you're single or married, so she might address you properly.
I identify as self-partnered.
I don't know what on God's green earth inspired them to make this decision. The audience obviously has to know the auditor is the bad guy and is going to give them trouble, but they don't even bother to go bold with it. They don't make her something they actually disdain with a passionate fury like a lesbian or a transgender person. It's almost like they can't even speak the words for fear of an ancient curse being released. Instead, they made her self-partnered, a thing which probably exists somewhere along the aromantic asexual spectrum, but which is hard to really associate with any particular ideology. Anybody can be those things. Still, the battle lines are drawn. The auditor is going to be trouble. She gives some recommendations and we're off to the races once more.
These are my recommendations to the state.
Escalation.
That's not up to me.
Again, my wife made an observation about this movie. She says the God's Not Dead series effectively backed itself into a corner focusing on education. God's Not Dead 1 is about an angry professor. God's Not Dead 2 is about a mention of Jesus in class. God's Not Dead 3 is about a conflict between campus and church. And We the People is about homeschool. She further suggested the reason they're about to pivot away from this kind of plot in the fifth movie is the astonishing failure of We the People to make any impact whatsoever. Smart woman. It was hard for audiences to care that Reverend Dave was falling apart while trying to stop his church from being demolished by people who weren't even really villainous in their personalities or their intent. It was really hard to find Jefferson Darcy menacing, even when he's throwing punches. It's even harder for them to care about people not being able to teach their children that dinosaurs weren't real in their living rooms. Let's be clear about one thing here. Homeschool is hardly regulated as it is. There have been a lot of really solid videos on this subject, but instead of that, let me tell a personal experience. I was in homeschool from 6th grade on. It wasn't for religious reasons, and I sort of manipulated them into it, but that's beyond the point. They did try to homeschool me with fundamentalist Christian materials by a group out of Pensacola, Florida called Abeka Academy. In fairness to Abeka, their materials on things like mathematics are solid enough if you understand mathematics, which my dad did not. That's not an indictment on him. I don't know anything about math either, and that isn't entirely his fault. The schools failed me well before homeschool did, but Abeka's other lessons were replete with young earth creationist delusions, and I knew that wasn't real. There was no oversight. I was doing the homeschool thing for about 6 years. Nobody dropped in to say so much as a single word over that whole time in 2 counties, one of them with a decent education system. We were registered with them as a homeschool family, but not a single time did they even call to ask how we were doing. Consequently, it was more unschooling than homeschooling. I can't remember doing a single page of work from 2004 to 2008. I ended up getting a GED instead of graduating properly, and I had a lot to catch up on. I still got into university, and everything worked out basically fine until I failed 3 math courses in a row, getting worse each time instead of better, and gave up entirely. In some ways, that is on me. In other ways, that is on homeschool itself. I don't know if I would have done better if I had gone to an actual school instead. That kind of thing is fundamentally unknowable, so I won't sweat it, but realizing just how unprepared I was for many aspects of university life because of homeschool did give me pause on the concept as a whole. The realization that it was almost entirely without regulation, that there were plenty of other people, like me, being unschooled. Homeschool, it should be noted, is not always this bad. It's not always the kind of situation where your parents try to indoctrinate you with terrible propaganda and neglect the important stuff, but that happens often enough, without oversight, that it makes this film's key complaints seem kind of silly. Yes, homeschool actually is a bad thing for a whole lot of kids, and we need to do something about that. That something doesn't have to be in terms of bans, but there needs to be more oversight. The school districts need to check in on families and guide them through an exploration of proper curricula. Furthermore, the parents need to be certain they themselves are capable of teaching the subjects. This is difficult, but not entirely impossible. The film so far totally avoids these issues. It sees homeschooling as fundamentally positive. In the real world, nothing is so clear-cut. There is a lot of nuance to this subject, and the nuance is totally missing here. In a lot of cases, homeschools have faced intervention only in cases where students were not being taught much of anything at all. The government does not care whether these schools are faith-based or even teaching their children that dinosaurs are the devil's work. They don't care. Abeka Academy is young Earth creationist, and they are still accredited. This is not a sign of big government gone rogue. I would like to imagine that I am a capable person, and somewhere in the past 11,000 words is something to prove that. But if I am, that capability didn't come from spending my teenage years not learning anything properly. I might have been a whole lot more capable if I had access to a proper education. I might have been worse off, but again, it's really hard to say. It's not that I have regrets about it for myself, but rather I have met people who went through similar situations and struggle to learn almost anything. They are stripped of all the normal tools to make it through life, and homeschool did do that to them. We the People is about to lay out an argument regarding freedom of choice. But who is this choice for exactly? Because if you are not giving your children the tools to make it through life, you aren't enabling their freedom, you are severely limiting it. Their available choices shrink, their futures narrow, and their lives are determined before they even begin. It's not like this in every case, but it happens often enough that we can firmly say this is a problem inherent to homeschooling. It's not that I think public schools or even private schools are just that great. It's that they equip you with essential skills that may otherwise be neglected. Socialization is a big one. Homeschool parents insist that they provide enough, but the internet is replete with stories proving otherwise. The confidence they have in their methods isn't rooted in reality. It's rooted in an unearned belief in their own capabilities. Returning to We the People, the problem is that the framing is absurd. In America, about 30% of people are religiously unaffiliated. Regardless of how they personally identify, somewhere around 20% of people in America do not believe in God. Yet out of the 435 members of the House of Representatives, only about 30 representatives are somewhere in the unaffiliated camp. That's more than ever before, but it's still under 10%. Congress is overwhelmingly Christian. They punch far above their actual weight in the general population, so where are all these anti-God politicians? Where are these politicians who want children to learn that God is dead? Where are the villains this movie is about? Has there ever been a national attempt to ban homeschooling that went anywhere? No, of course not. Schooling is controlled largely at the state and local levels. The states set the standards, and then the counties have to enforce those standards, plus their own priorities. The federal government does have expectations of the states to keep education equal and of a certain quality, but that's about it. The federal government isn't really doing much intervention in your local school board unless they're doing something terrible. The God's Not Dead universe cannot accept this. The mere fact that so much of the population doesn't even care about religion anymore is taken as a sign that public schools are out to bring about the death of God. But even if religion was perfectly proportional in Congress, the non-believers don't want to ban Christianity. I am pretty radically secular, but I don't want to ban homeschools. I don't want to ban Christian elements from them. I don't care. I just want kids to actually be educated and taken care of in ways they don't seem to be a lot of the time. I hate to continue ranting when we're supposed to be watching a movie, but if we're this far in, I doubt you really care, so I'll give it one more short one and then we're back to the nightmare. Don't worry, it was on in the background with Fox News host Jeanine Pirro appearing as a judge telling them to educate their children. She needs to pick a lane, honestly. In the last one, she was a TV show host, and now she's a judge in some random Arkansas town. But I digress. As I pointed out at the very beginning, the titular quote is a misunderstanding of its source. Nietzsche was warning us that the fall of belief in God was a symptom of a larger problem, that we no longer have the ability to believe in anything, and bereft of belief, we are prone to creeping nihilism. The God's Not Dead series is unknowingly a victim of the very thing it claims to be against. It wants us to believe in something greater than ourselves. It wants us to believe not just in God, but in grand narratives about the importance of faith. It wants us to believe that Christianity really is under attack, not just from governments, but powers and principalities. The Christian persecution complex is a key function of the faith. Christians must be under attack. But then we are met with the fundamental contradiction of the series. The God's Not Dead universe is one of open, brazen hostility to people of faith. It is supposed to be not entirely unlike our own, but an extension of it, a warning of what could happen. But even in this world of open hostility to faith, the Christians always win. Their would-be oppressors are vanquished, or at the very least, met in the middle. In the only deviation from the God always wins formula, Reverend Dave isn't actually defeated. He literally receives a message from God telling him to give up, that faith is more than just a building. The fact that they have built a world foundationally hostile to God, in which they almost always win anyway, is an indictment on the whole persecution fantasy. It shows that not even they can believe in the premise that they are building. There is nothing unbeatable through God, even in this harsh dream world. So why are they so concerned about the real one? And I think the answer is a simple one. They do not believe what they are saying. There is an astonishing lack of heart and sincerity running throughout this series. These things are only allowed to be shown within the realm of interpersonal conflict.
I'm so sorry. About Jude, I am so sorry.
That's revealing. It shows that what they really believe in is the individual. These meta-narratives about grand conflict and the power of faith are merely distractions from the truth. God is dead, even in a series intended to prove the opposite. This is a natural conclusion to the evangelical and broader fundamentalist project. Their intense focus on individuals has come at cost. It removes the collective nature of religion. In doing so, it removes the greater purpose of religion. If the only purpose is to convert individuals, there is nothing deeper being built. It's about individuals. In order for meaning to exist in the way they want it to, it has to transcend exactly this kind of individualism. But it can't. It isn't allowed to. It has built a world where the individual relationship with Christ is the most important thing, and thus created a greater ego in the individual Christian. Jesus' life is no longer the focus, his story no longer a beacon. It is the Christian. God's Not Dead 3 was the strongest revelation of this fact. Everything was about Reverend Dave and his personal life. They cannot cure what ails them because their very own theological and ideological underpinnings are the source of the problem. They cannot bring themselves to acknowledge this, but it is clearly shown in their performances. The primary narratives pale in comparison to what is actually compelling in the series: interpersonal drama. They can't be bothered to put their hearts into the over-conflict, but they can put their hearts into the drama of the individual, and they do. There is no God in God's Not Dead at all. He is not there. He exists only in whispers and shouts, but no longer truly in the hearts or minds of men. He has been vanquished, and not by these powers and principalities, but by the believers themselves. He is not the star. He is a footnote. The self rules above all else here. And this situation can only be remedied by Josh Wheat. Reverend Jude's back.
In Nigeria, many of the people that we minister to are only ever a moment away from death. Death from hunger, disease, bad water. Villagers walk to church, many for hours. They don't say, "Oh, I have to go to church today." They say, "Yes, it's Sunday. I get to go to church." In the back country, people don't have money.
That's right, they killed him off for nothing and then had him appear in a dream to shore up the faith of Reverend Dave once more. It's like the final insult. Reverend Dave kills this man and they bring him back in a dream solely to make Dave feel better. The series may have well changed its name to Everything About Dave at this point, but I really do like this scene. That may sound curious, but it is the one part of the movie that focuses on something serious, something actually meaningful. Reverend Jude tells Dave about the struggles of the impoverished and dying Christians of Africa. It does what I would have wanted the entire film to do, and then it's over and we're back to the bullshit. But I like Reverend Jude. I unironically want a whole movie about him. God's Not Dead, The Heart of Ghana. We get a single moment of sincerity, a single moment of truth, a single moment that really matters, and then we're back to Reverend Dave's terrible and great struggle against the oppressive force of mild government oversight. The church members end up talking it over. Some of them suggest they're giving up and putting their kids in private schools instead.
Well, that's it. We're gonna enroll our kids into Oakwood on Monday.
Look at this. You know the Andersons, right? Okay, all their kids go to Oakwood. Maddie Anderson brought that home from school.
This is an advertisement for birth control.
Yeah.
How garish, how terrible for them. But luckily, Reverend Dave comes in to save the day by funding the legal battle. Oh God, not another fucking...
A church will stand with you on this. We'll organize a plan and help with any court costs and attorney fees if need be.
Dave, the church doesn't have those kinds of funds.
This is the third legal battle in a row, allegedly. It's like the bread and butter of the series. It's like they're trapped in a law and order paradigm. They cannot escape, but something else occurred to me at this point. What happened to Pierce? You know, Reverend Dave's brother, the lawyer? The guy whose entire arc in God's Not Dead 3 revolved around reconnecting with Dave and fighting these exact kinds of cases for free? And now, in a movie that literally focuses on a desperate, high-stakes legal battle, Pierce is just gone? No explanation, no excuse, not even a throwaway line about him being busy or something? He's just gone? But don't worry, it's fine. There is no legal battle. Yeah, you heard me right about that. There is no legal battle. They just spent all of this time setting up a legal battle, and it just doesn't happen. It's just completely irrelevant. I mean, there is legal wrangling under the surface, but that is not what this movie is about at all. In fact, they only resolve that particular plot line in the credits, after the movie is over. If you were one of the 9 people who saw this movie in theaters, you probably walked out before even realizing that plot line was actually resolved. And I know what you're thinking, but don't worry. There is a romantic side plot.
Teachers don't have favorites. No, there's no pressure to be popular, I guess.
But at this point, neither you nor I have the ability or desire to stomach whatever is happening, so we're just gonna ignore that.
No way. Not this time. No, not this time. It's totally made up. Pure fiction. Never happened. It's an urban legend that never happened.
Reverend Force 5 visits Washington, D.C. to lobby against the bill.
Reverend, I trust that Jimmy's pizza didn't give you nightmares?
That's not what kept me up last night.
I can't thank you all enough for making the trip, especially since I know how difficult things are for you at home.
What bill? I have no idea. I have no idea what's happening. There is no explanation for this outcome. One second it's, let's lawyer up for this legal battle that's going to be very expensive and probably bankrupt the church, and then the next it's, actually, you know, I've never seen Washington, D.C. before. Let's check that out. Money? What money? This is just a GoFundMe scam at this point. And if that wasn't bad enough, we get this.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
It really seems like a large portion of the Washington, D.C. trip is dedicated to trailer lines. That's what happens over and over during these scenes. They say something that could be quoted in a trailer to make the plot seem more interesting and pressing than it actually is.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom.
There's also a weird insinuation of Christian nationalism after the trailer quote montage.
The Washington Monument is 55 feet at the base and 555 feet high. At the very top, there's an aluminum cap where there's an inscription. Laos Deo. 2 words, 7 letters, overlooking the most powerful city in the world. It means praise be to God.
Then Reverend Dave meets with a congressman in a pizza place.
Pizza? No, but I'm sure I can find it.
Comet Pizza? Pizzagate is real.
You made it safe and sound. Thanks for coming.
They briefly mention a program called Common Core, which is exactly what it sounds like, a federal standard intended to shore up understanding in some key areas of learning that have been slipping for a while.
And right now there's an effort underway to mandate universal educational guidelines.
Sounds reasonable.
No, it's meant to. But make no mistake, those guidelines are increasingly at odds with the Christian worldview.
Common Core was already old news by the time this film came out in 2021, and it shows. They don't tell you what is bad about it. They just assume it is bad because it involves the government. It has to be part of the anti-God conspiracy by default. But they are not content to dryly remark on the nature of a federal set of standards. Instead, Reverend Dave's congressman friend, who it should be noted is black, says that children are being indoctrinated politically by these standards, leading to a truly befuddling exchange.
Ask your average millennial about our founding fathers, and they'll tell you that they were all a bunch of old and rich oppressive slave owners. That perspective came from somewhere.
But weren't they?
Most of them were just kids. Edward Rutledge and Thomas Lynch both were just 26 years old when they signed the Declaration of Independence, and Thomas Jefferson was the ripe old age of 33 when he helped write it.
This all depends very highly on who we're calling founding fathers. The signers of the Declaration of Independence had an average age around 40 years old. Kids, these were not. About a third of them owned slaves. This is substantially higher than the 5 to 10% of colonists who actually owned slaves at the time the document was signed. Even in 1860, the number of Southerners owning slaves was only roughly on par with the founders at around 30%. Now, the congressman is correct when he points to some signers in their 20s and 30s, but as conservatives like to point out, the world of 1776 is very different than the world of today. In that era, children often worked in some capacity as soon as they were able. The very idea of childhood was different. Regular jobs would often come about between 13 and 16. Full independence was legally at 21, but life expectancy for those who survived childhood was much lower and less wealthy, into the 50s and 60s. The overall effect of these factors is that average people were likely to be a whole lot more weathered and mature by their mid-20s than they are today. This was not an easy life, full of luxury and creature comforts. Our very concept of kids being innocent and pure, unjaded and untroubled is a very modern thought in itself. On the other hand, if we are talking about the Constitution, of those who took part in the Constitutional Convention, almost half were slave owners. Almost all of them were wealthy. Only about 6 of those people were involved with the creation of the Declaration of Independence a decade earlier. The idea that many of those most intimately involved in the creation of the United States were older, wealthier, and involved with the slave trade is widespread precisely because it is true. This is an indisputable fact. These are not unknown figures. We know their names and a great deal about their lives. Arguing otherwise is intellectual dishonesty, plain and simple. These incredible understatements about controversial figures are part and parcel for American conservatives and fundamentalists more broadly. It is necessary for the founders to be moral icons because the story of America, the one they believe in, demands it. But what does this have to do with God? If I were to be especially generous here, it could certainly be the case that the Founding Fathers believed natural rights come from the Christian God. However, there's a problem. Nothing they've said here indicates that's the case. Not one thing in this conversation was about convincing us of anything other than we've been lied to about the Founding Fathers, which we have not, at least not in schools.
Gotta admit the pizza isn't sitting well with me.
No, listen to me. I'm heavy. There's a lot to digest, man.
There are obviously people on the internet who, to make a point, will tell you the Founding Fathers owned slaves. It's debatable whether or not painting with such a wide brush is a positive thing, but there is a hint of truth to it at least. After all, what does it say about you if you do business with those who think it is perfectly fine to own human beings? This is not to say that I personally condemn the Founding Fathers as a whole, but rather I recognize the source of the criticism, that it comes from a place of genuine disgust over this situation. The hypocrisy was indeed immense. Let's be clear about one other thing. This narrative building is in support of what is called the American civil religion. It builds up the founding fathers not as normal men with flaws like everyone else, but instead as quasi-prophets of a new order. It is okay to admit that they were flawed. It is okay to admit that they were hypocrites. It is okay to accuse men of doing the things men are known to do. But in framing the framers this way, they are venturing far outside the realm of Christianity and backing up what is essentially a secular religion. This is the theology of a man-made kingdom. I doubt they realize it, but they are performing what is essentially an act of idolatry. If you think those words are too strong, I would encourage you to look into the American civil religion. It is called that for a reason, and they are its truest believers. Now, I should clarify something else here. This line of thought comes perilously close to a Ben Shapiro-esque, you complain about society and yet you live in it, disingenuous argument. I'm not saying Christians don't have the right to care about the country they live in, or its stories, or its future. It belongs to them every bit as much as it belongs to anyone else. But I am questioning this degree of sacredness with which they treat man-made creations. It is directly opposed to the central tenets of their religion. In their Common Core hearing, a Taylor Lorenz lookalike tells Congress that homeschooling is necessary because, for some reason or another, their district teaches a progressive version of history, and that's bad, I guess.
Let me give you an example. So in our district, they teach a revisionist version of history, which is both progressive and anti-faith in equal measure. And so if our children are forced onto its Common Core track, they will never learn about the faith-based underpinnings of the U.S. Constitution or its Bill of Rights.
There is also some interesting cherry-picking happening about homeschool students testing better than public school students.
There's a common misconception of homeschool parents, particularly those of faith, that we're some kind of flat earthers. My 7-year-old knows that the earth is round and that the sunrise is an illusion caused by the earth's rotation. And when tested in physics or chemistry about the rate of acceleration of a falling object or the atomic mass of cesium, acceptable answers do not include Jesus or whatever God wants it to be.
This is suspicious to say the very least. There have been studies done showing a higher performance from homeschool students, and surprise, surprise, most of these are done by groups created to advocate homeschooling. Their research is known to have significant problems like non-random sampling. This implies a degree of selection bias. In other words, these organizations pick the top-performing students and use that as evidence for homeschooling being successful. Other studies have shown a phenomenon called the math gap. It is so prevalent it has a name. This phenomenon does have studies that have been done properly, featuring random sampling and double-blind comparisons of testing. It turns out no matter what feature you control for, the results are consistent and strong, indicating this math gap. This one Christian homeschool may be performing at a higher level than public schools, and there are always these sorts of exceptions, but what about the average homeschool student that has been almost unanimously shown to test lower in math, a subject so important that it is mandatory across a wide range of fields at advanced levels? This problem is not even acknowledged. I tried really hard to care about all of the trailer dialogue and attempts to sound like this issue matters. I really did. I wanted to put myself in the shoes of the characters. But it's just impossible. Listen to this.
And lastly, my husband was a United States Air Force pilot who fought for our freedoms and died in service to this country. So if it's all the same to you, I would prefer you call me Mrs. Hayes, out of respect of my marriage and to my husband's memory.
And all of these people are just so aggressive for no reason whatsoever.
Reverend Hill, how do you answer the comment by former U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Chairman Martin Castro, and here I quote, "The phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, as long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, or any form of intolerance."
But by far the most interesting thing they do in this movie as a whole is gather a group to discuss why homeschool is important to them. There are some good reasons.
We homeschool because most of the schools in my area are chronically underfunded.
Not to mention institutionalized racism.
My son has special needs. Public schools just aren't equipped.
And some not so good reasons.
I want to be able to choose which immunizations my children receive.
And even reasons that demand a wider societal conversation that this movie is not ready to have.
Bullying, violence, school shootings.
I like to think that I'm a sympathetic person. I really do. I'm not even some left-wing zealot that hates freedom or whatever. I am a cringe libertarian. I want people to be left to their own thing most of the time. If it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg and all that good stuff. But it's hard to be sympathetic to problems that originate in conservative ideology writ large. An ideology that God's Not Dead clearly embraces, despite its occasional weird nods to liberalism. It is a real problem that schools are underfunded. Some of that indeed originates in systemic racism. A lot of schools simply aren't prepared to deal with special needs children. There is a shortage of teachers more broadly, and school shootings are a real threat to the well-being of children everywhere in the United States. A real example of conservative politics causing the same problems that makes homeschooling a necessity for many of these parents comes in the form of Kansas Governor Sam Brownback. He was a Tea Party conservative and cut school funding in an attempt to foster the growth of private schools backed by religious organizations and conservative big donors. This is not simply my opinion. This is a fact. He did that. This move caused schools to be underfunded. It resulted in massive cuts to special needs educational programs. It caused a severe shortage of teachers. This series of events was completely catastrophic to the education system of Kansas. It especially impacted families from minority and underprivileged backgrounds, but it spared no one. The reaction to this manufactured catastrophe was immense, if not necessarily immediate. In a state almost totally won over by Tea Party conservative ideology, Sam Brownback's supporters were ultimately kicked out of office. Republicans from all over the state, corner to corner, rose up and voted in more moderate politicians on the pledge to refund schools, but Kansas still hasn't recovered. Entire lives have been ruined or had the scales tipped against them from the start. This is the damage that unchecked ideology can do. It can cause so much chaos that even the people most in support of it turn the other way. The Sam Brownback fiasco signaled the end of the Tea Party movement and the broader shift to populist Republicans, people like President Trump that were perceived at the time as being more moderate on these sorts of issues. But the film doesn't talk about that. It can't. These aren't failures of liberal big government, these are failings of their own movement. This is the result of evangelicals and fundamentalists falling hook, line, and sinker for this Tea Party paranoia about government overreach. I am sympathetic to people who fell for lies and were hit so hard by the results that they turned it all around. That's what I want people to do. I like that. If politicians do harm, you show them who they serve, and the voters of Kansas did just that. But I am not sympathetic to people who are anti-vaccination, proving from the outset that they are prone to much more nefarious forms of propaganda. Propaganda that threatens not just education, but the very idea of public health. My health. God's Not Dead 4 had to include the anti-vaccination people, and it signaled the broader movement of the anti-vaccine crowd towards Republicans. At the time, this was easy for people to miss on the outside, but God's Not Dead seemed to know what we didn't. They deserve at least partial credit for that, although they probably still saw it as mandatory liberal outreach at the time. I'm not saying that conservatism is the source of every problem, but rather that it creates a lot of problems which it unfairly blames its opponents for. Education is of poor quality and is underfunded as the result of bad policy in certain red states. Solution: blame the Democrats. Gun violence has reached epidemic levels in the country as a whole, but is especially notable in schools. Solution: blame the Democrats. There is no introspection, only blame. The standout actor in this entire film is the Muslim dad from the first movie. If you don't remember him, that's okay, we didn't talk about him much at all. He didn't have much of an arc in the first movie. He appeared, was mean to his daughter, and then vanished into the ether, but God's Not Dead 4 reminds us that he still exists. And not only does he exist, he converts to Christianity after a crisis. I don't care about the crisis, and you don't either, but the scene where he questions God is actually great.
She must have blood. Take mine instead. Let Aisha live. I'll do anything. Anything.
Reverend Dave comes before the committee and gives his final speech, and it is kind of awkward.
And the funny thing is they're not even from America. They're from faraway places like China, Iran, Africa.
In the classic movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the titular Mr. Smith, played by Jimmy Stewart, becomes a senator and ends up at odds with the powers that be. He engages in a standing filibuster after being unfairly accused of corruption. That leads to this incredible moment.
I stand guilty as framed because Section 40 is graft. And I was ready to say so. I was ready to tell you that a certain man in my state, a Mr. James Taylor, wanted to put through this dam for his own profit. A man who controls a political machine and controls everything else worth controlling in my state. Yes, and a man even powerful enough to control Congressman. And I saw 3 of them in his room the day I went up to see him. Will you Senator yield? No, sir, I will not yield.
God's Not Dead 4 attempts to create this same kind of moment. A defiant shout that people will remember 100 years later. It doesn't work.
Our children don't belong to the government, and neither does our country. America belongs to its citizens. To each and all, to the farmers in Texas, to the window cleaners in New York, to the cabinet makers in Maine and the teachers in Oklahoma, to every man, woman, and child, it belongs to the people. We, the people.
But he wins, I guess. He did it. Freedom is saved. God is still not dead. Hallelujah. And that's God's Not Dead 4. The other movies in the series sometimes ventured into plot lines that could be considered vaguely compelling. No doubt they did this entirely by accident, but they still did it. This movie just skips all of that. It's hard to tell what exactly We the People is even trying to do. We begin foreshadowing a high-stakes legal battle that simply never comes. Instead, we get another courtroom drama, but this time without the courtroom, transposed onto the halls of power in Washington, D.C., and what's more interesting than that? Watching God's Not Dead C-SPAN edition. This movie is completely inexplicable. You could lock the world's top minds in a room for a decade and they would never come up with this. And equally inexplicable is the endless whining over Common Core, which is somehow depicted as the singular greatest evil since the serpent in the Garden of Eden. There is simply nothing here, and I still wrote 7,000 words about it. What is wrong with me? God's Not Dead 5, In God We Trust. We have reached the end of our journey, the finale, the big boss, the God's Not Dead of legend, the one surprisingly few people have seen. It didn't have a major theatrical release and barely anyone has reviewed it. It's the only one without a Wikipedia page. I'm sure that means we have very little to talk about, right? Right? Ray Wise is back as the big bad Pete Kane from the second film. At least there's that. He is a real actor and he's good at it. Not like, well, you know.
I am so sorry.
Ray Wise is something utterly unthinkable. A Democrat running against what he openly calls religious superstition in Arkansas. And he's expected to win because his opponent kicked the bucket? Look, this is a constituency that would sooner elect a dead guy. They've done it before.
Well, there's an interesting election result in North Dakota. David Endall, a popular Republican candidate, has been elected to the state legislature. But the 55-year-old died of COVID-19 weeks ago.
So, everybody sits around watching Reverend Dave give his speech from the last movie, now seen to have 60 million views, which is ironic. And naturally, since it's his movie, everybody talks about how great he is.
Hill represents what we've lost in politics. And yes, he is a man of faith, and he is a man of the people.
Yeah, sure, okay. Apparently, despite his incredible viral success, his church is experiencing some problems. Big government socialism is back in town and it has pulled the grant for a women's shelter because they had a Bible study.
The government pulled the grant money because, are you ready for this? Some women at the center had a Bible study.
In the real world, mind you, this is literally unthinkable. A sane person simply would not think it. But we're not in the real world. We're not in a world of sanity. We're in Dave's world now. Every movie so far has alluded to the idea that America is about to experience something akin to Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution. Accordingly, there are discussions about socialism taking over if Democrats win the House, and Martin Yip, the former Chinese student turned guy who hangs around Dave for some reason, says it's really happening this time.
About 50 years ago, the Chinese government, under the guise of progress, blamed all the country's problems on religion and faith. They called it the Cultural Revolution. A similar revolution seems to be brewing here in America, David. It may look different, but the essence is the same.
I would like to attribute this solely to the kind of fictionalized narratives that drive movies about dystopian futures. I would like to, but I can't. This is not really a fictionalized world, but neither is it the real world. It is the paranoia-driven world fundamentalists believe they actually live in. To them, this is not what could happen, this is fully what is happening. What we see as completely impossible, they see as merely stark realities. This creates an interesting cognitive dissonance. The world of God's Not Dead is one where the socialist menace is only ever 1 or 2 seats from taking over and changing everything, and yet the world is shown to operate exactly the same way it always has. It's really hard to believe it's all over when there's a casual county fair scene right after the hyperbolic Mao Zedong bit.
Sure, why not?
Oh, you know it's rigged, don't you?
Oh, yeah? Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, the rings are too small and can't win unless you find the right angle.
I'm noticing another problem that has eluded me before. Namely, Reverend Dave pretends to be ignorant at every turn. His character is someone who simultaneously has the solutions to the problems of the world, and yet doesn't understand anything about that world. He gives this supposedly incredible speech which got widespread attention. A political speech. But then he tells someone he doesn't know anything about politics.
Well, this isn't nearly enough, but we did our best. Thanks so much, Cap. Sure thing, Brad. Thank you.
You know, as a congressman, you'll be able to add zeros to your charity drives.
I don't know anything about politics.
What do you mean, Dave? You've been involved in political struggles for the last 4 movies in the series. The Newsboys are back, and I'm not going to lie to you here. I really like their music. It's the singing that sucks. I don't just mean the I Love Jesus lyrics. That can be perfectly fine in the right context. The doom metal band Trouble did that very well. But no, I mean the vocals themselves. The singing does not at all complement the music. The music is this cool new wave post-punk revival thing, and the vocals are generic pop artist. I'm half convinced these dudes just wanted to play new wave, but realized they'd get nowhere with that, and decided to make it Christian because nobody is more starved of good tunes, but I digress. The Newsboys, it turns out, adore Reverend Dave, just like everybody else. Fuck's sake, dude, we get it. He's great. Everybody loves Dave. Jesus Christ, give it a rest. Then he's on Huckabee. What says cultural and political relevance like being on Huckabee with an audience full of gray hair? You're really turning things around here, Dave. Your voters will be nothing but memories before your term is up. I hope you feel good about yourself. My poor wife, perplexed as she is by this whole endeavor of ours, had a good question about 30 minutes in. So what's this movie about? The women's shelter? No. The answer is no. Just like the last one wasn't about the lawsuit that never happened, and the one before that wasn't about the sermons thing. This one has nothing at all to do with the women's shelter. That's just a signpost for big government socialism. The real issue is Peter Kane, the Maoist running for office in Deep Red, Arkansas. While explaining this plot to her and feeling the gears turning in my slowly decaying mind, I had another realization. Pete Kane, he's a walking contradiction. Peter, the rock on which I will build my church. Cain, the killer of Abel. What the hell are they trying to say about this guy? I thought Cain was very on the nose until I remembered his name was also Peter. Who are you, Peter Kane? Why are you named that? You start to realize that there is a rhyme and reason to the twists and turns that came after the first movie. Everything was leading to this. This is the moment. This is the one where the people try to take back power once and for all by doing the unthinkable, by electing a Republican in Arkansas. God damn it. And then we get back into the hardcore stupid, the real stuff.
I go to church, and I've got a pastor, but I don't think I'd vote for him. You know?
Is your pastor running for office?
No, but...
Then it probably won't be an issue for either of you.
You know, I think that Larry is just pointing out the obvious here, that clergy and politics is a controversial topic.
I have 2 thoughts. First, who the hell ever said that clergy should stay out of politics in this way? This is not a thought I have ever heard a single person so much as hint at. Not one deranged soul out of the litany of deranged souls that have consumed so much of my time. Second, they always trot out that one remark. The founders wanted to keep government out of religion, not religion out of government. But you have to ask, what's the difference? What is the practical difference between these 2 thoughts? None. There is no difference. It's sophistry. It's empty. empty, vacant, vacuous logic. It means nothing. I get it. I get what they're trying to say. I understand the idea behind the thought. But if a religious movement were to take over a government, what do you think that religious movement will do? It will pass favoritist laws benefiting its own at the expense of others. And they swear up and down that's not the goal. They probably even believe it. But every time they get into office, they show their asses in this exact way. Every single time. Recently, the Trump administration created a faith office. It's awesome. Neutral name. Not Office for Christian Affairs or Office for Loving Jesus More Gooder. I'm sure it will be headed by a totally responsible, middle-of-the-road, completely inoffensive...
Mahanda akasata, reke yamanda raboko sokota, ronda yakande eke seke la mama manda rabakase.
Paula White. It's TV preacher Paula White. They're not even pretending anymore. Trump is out there talking about defending Christianity in America, the most Christian country in the world by far, and they love it. This is exactly what happens. They don't want separation of church and state. Not really. They want church to be the state.
Christian morality. This interview was supposed to pull you out of the fire. You threw yourself back in. What part of stay in the boat do you not understand?
He took what I said out of context.
Oh, really? A politician doing something like that? You're trying to become a congressman, not the Pope.
Yeah, stop talking about God. Voters in Arkansas, they really hate that. You know, the atheist stronghold of Arkansas. So it just occurred to me, being the American that I am, the rest of the world exists. There are other countries in it, and in those other countries, people may not get the Arkansas references. So the sarcasm is because Arkansas is very, very religious, very, very right-wing. You practically cannot become elected in Arkansas if you don't believe in God and talk about him, like, all the time, like more than, like, politics. One of the most jarring things about this movie is that what you could consider normal people, people like you and I, people who are working class or whatever, are completely missing. They are gone, replaced by plastic people, and I do mean plastic people. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with plastic surgery, but what I am saying is that it's a pretty weird change for a series that is supposed to be about normal people and their struggles. Everything here signals power, privilege, and beauty. In the words of the great philosopher Genghis of Forest, natural's not in it. In this movie, no one is normal except the extras without lines, the crowd at the Huckabee show, the people Reverend Dave is talking to about his campaign that never speak. Real people are relegated to roles that won't embarrass the grand production being made here. It removes the relatability of it. It's not even about the political aspect of the movie either. There are plenty of scenes that could use regular people, but the film eschews that entirely. This is like watching the fall of Rome in real time. Once there was potential, an empire of creation, of possibility, something at the very least real. But now only fallen temples remain. Vines and weeds creep over fractured temples, a silent testament to what was. Whatever was good in this world is gone, vanished. There is no future.
I now realize that your issue isn't whether or not the government needs God, it's that you believe the government is God.
No, the role of government is to make lives better. Why do you have a problem with that?
I don't, but I do have a problem with big government. It spreads like a cancer.
Oh, please. Government allocates money to help people.
Yes, but to give, the government must first take. It's a cycle that breeds dependency, not solutions.
Oh, and you think your church groups could do it better?
The church fills gaps the government can't in many ways, especially in moral guidance.
Hey Dave, wasn't this whole thing essentially kicked off by the fact that your government grants were taken away? Wasn't that what brought you into the fore? Wasn't that your whole thing? And if the churches can do it alone, why do you need government money, Dave? You don't pay taxes, so you can't blame that. Is Dave socialist? Has Dave gone Maoist? Anyway, Reverend Dave is accused of fraud. Oh no, not the most honest man in town, apparently.
Bank's Board of Trustees that irrefutably demonstrate that the account numbers in question are completely fabricated. Therefore, and this is important, the wires that the Hill campaign accused Senator Kaine of sending and receiving could not possibly have come from their bank.
Unbelievable. How could you do this to us? I think what's really funny is that we're just expected to know that Reverend Dave is a righteous man that would never do anything like this. We're expected to accept without question that he is a moral paragon, a beacon of integrity, an incorruptible force of good, but we don't. We don't think of him that way. We've never seen any real evidence of that. What we have seen is a man who routinely bends the truth, who engages in self-serving grandstanding, and who magically avoids consequences for everything he does. And now, suddenly, we're supposed to be outraged that anyone would dare question him? No! If this were real life and you just saw the pastor who spent the past 4 consecutive movies getting himself into incredibly shady legal situations and in one of them killed his best friend, wouldn't you at least raise an eyebrow? He may have forgotten what he did to Reverend Jude, but I sure haven't. And I'm not saying that Reverend Dave is for sure a fraud. I'm just saying that if the IRS or whoever else had a reason to investigate a church, this is exactly what it would look like.
City's gonna condemn the shelter if we can't get it up to code.
And this right here is the coup de grace. He literally runs a shelter for vulnerable women, both pregnant and with babies, that isn't up to code. He's lucky all he's got is an allegation of fraud to deal with. Imagine if that news dropped. I can see it now. Fire Hazard Dave, the baby-slaying madman of Arkansas. And let's not forget that that is exactly how Reverend Jude died. This man deliberately avoids keeping things up to code, people get hurt or worse, and then it's somebody else's fault. That goddamned Uncle Sam, making me protect other people's safety.
Your campaign that sets the example for Christian involvement in the civic square.
What about non-believers?
What about them? Things are so bad out there. We build it right, they will come.
Wrong, wrong, wrong. No, we will not. We do not want it. Pass. Better ideas, please, fellas. The Newsboys appear to pray.
Yeah, the internet said he was set up.
Goodness. We should probably pray for David, guys. Let's do it.
He admitted to wrongdoing.
God, we pray right now, Lord, for our brother David. He stands in the gap.
That's practically the only thing they ever do. So I hope it works. I hope Jesus loves them so much he gets them a better singer himself. There is one final debate. The debate to end all... forget it. I can't even pretend anymore. We all know Reverend Dave is going to win. Nobody has been all that interested until now. He's being demolished in the polls somehow, but this one debate is about to do it because Reverend Dave is just that awesome. Forget campaign strategy. Forget voter outreach. Forget reality. One speech from Dave is all it takes. We're about to witness the most predictable, least earned, most sanctimonious debate victory in cinematic history. Let's get it over with.
We cannot remove God from the fabric of our country without risk of it collapsing.
Imagine, if all Christians mobilized and voted, do you know what would happen? Ask him. He does. And it terrifies him. You have the power to change things. Not me, not him, you.
Dave wins the election. Dave always wins. We are all Dave now. We cannot escape him. This man is beyond accountability in any sense of the word. All he has to do is give a speech and the rubes forgive him of everything. It doesn't matter that there is actual evidence that he is a bad person. It doesn't matter that he isn't charismatic. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters anymore at all. God's not dead. 5. If I had to give a short summary of God's Not Dead and my experiences with it, this is what I would say. Now is the hard part. What do I think of God's Not Dead after seeing 5 of them in a row? What do I think of the series? What do I think? I think it is monumental. It is a monument to paranoia, stupidity, melodrama, wasting money, and most importantly, the ego of one man who shall remain nameless. God's Not Dead has accomplished what no other series has. It has made me want to pray. More than once, for the first time in my entire life, I have wanted to pray that the Lord, in his infinite mercy, end it all. Everything. All of us. The entire universe must crumble. But we already knew all of that. I've spent a really long time talking about that. So I guess now what we should do is return to Earth, the one that actually exists beyond all of the fever dreams and existential dread, and we should try and make something of this experience. My friend Kevin from the YouTube channel Say Goodnight Kevin had a piece of insight that I missed. He agreed in essence about David A.R. White's ego being catastrophic for the direction and the future of the series, but he also put things into perspective. The first movie hit at the tail end of a Christian persecution fantasy, which sprang up from the ashes of the 1990s. He didn't elaborate much more than that, but I think I get the gist of what he was saying. If I don't, I must apologize, but he's a busy man these days. Still, I will try to give this a fair shake. I think what he was pointing to is the sense that 9/11 was not just an attack on Americans, but an attack on Christians. That the election of Barack Obama, allegedly a Muslim, was a great conspiracy by the powers that be to destroy America and usher in the global caliphate. The Tea Party's emergence blunted some of this energy, but the fantasy didn't fully die until Donald Trump unexpectedly won in 2016. That one event changed the nature of the beast. Trump may not have been one of them on the details, but he was one of them in spirit. No longer did they have to fear the encroaching neoliberal socialist order. Never mind the fact that those ideologies are actually in contradiction. Never mind the fact that reality is more complicated than the election of one man or the transformative nature of one or two terms. God's Not Dead captured something that wasn't coming back anytime soon. It's the result of the same complacency that washed over liberals after Obama won the first time. The same liberal complacency that led to those massive Tea Party victories. The fundamentalists, previously so oppressed, had their champion, and these kinds of narratives were just no longer relevant by the time God's Not Dead 2 came out. There was no longer such a need for wish fulfillment because the wish had been fulfilled. If we view the whole series through that lens, everything changes. It puts in perspective the bizarre wanderings of a series now lost in victory. It recontextualizes everything that came after. I think there is a lot of truth in this narrative. After all, it isn't entirely Kevin's, it's merely my interpretation of his. Still, I think we've done his narrative justice, even though my interpretation may be completely off base. When I say that God's Not Dead is monumental, I mean monumental for more than its flaws. That's too simple a story for this franchise. The franchise still means something, and we can see through its adventures it was trying to find the meaning. A lot of the time it missed, and when it missed hard. But in God's Not Dead 5, I think it finally found itself. It's just a shame that nobody was really around to see it except us. I'm not saying that God's Not Dead 5 is good. Far from it, but there is a sense of completeness that I can say I wasn't expecting. There is nowhere to go. The greener grass has been found and trampled. If there is a future to this project, it is more of the same. But that doesn't mean there wasn't something worthwhile to be found here in what should be the last of them. What I mean is, God's Not Dead 5 finally accepts what it is and what its mission is. It doesn't mess around. It gives you the full-throated narrative about the kind of change they want to achieve. It is a change where they take power, and they do it for the good of everyone, including you and I, allegedly. In some sense, they have achieved that acquisition of power in the re-election of President Trump. He's their guy. He's doing what they want. They love him for a reason. But we can't entirely reduce it to that either. This petty politics that has become so very loud over the last 15 years or so. That's unfair to us, and it's unfair to them. Sure, the battle lines have been drawn, and we are all involved, but what we have to understand is what they actually want, because I think that's a harder subject to really grasp, even for them. I recently read a book on Christian Reconstructionism. It's called Building God's Kingdom, and it's mostly about a man named R.J. Rushdoony. Rushdoony was a thought leader in the movement. Even if God's Not Dead doesn't know about Rushdoony, as many fundamentalists don't, it's irrelevant. His influence is so widespread in Protestant culture that his existence alone has a lot of explanatory power. They do not merely seek power for power's sake, as they so clearly believe we do. They view the world as a real battleground between good and evil, and whatever happens in between is irrelevant. That's why these narratives are so single-minded, that even when they reach out, they do it in kind of a two-faced way. They come with the extended hand of friendship, but behind their back is a sword. This is the way they want to save us. It's right there in the dialogue when they talk about non-believers being brought on board. They don't mean we will voluntarily join their new crusade as non-believers, but rather we will find something to believe in, and that something will be them and what they want to build for us, God's kingdom. The saying every accusation is a confession is actually kind of cringe, and we probably shouldn't use it as much as we do, but there is some truth to it. They paint the secular world as one that wants to destroy Christianity and usher in atheism because they want to do the exact opposite. They want to destroy the secular world and usher in a golden age of fundamentalist Christianity, whether you and I like it or not. We are obviously quite deep into the weeds now, and we could end it there, but before we do, I want us to take a moment to imagine something together. I want us to imagine God's Not Dead 6. Reverend Dave is now President Dave. The Oval Office is a repurposed church basement. The American flag has been replaced by a cross that has been poorly stitched together by a German electrician. He is exacting. The Declaration of Independence has been rewritten. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created Christian. There is a random cut to stock footage of Ronald Reagan. Nobody acknowledges it. The entire movie is dubbed in post because the sound crew locked themselves in a garage with a running car. It was an electric car, but it was also a Tesla, so it caught on fire anyway. The camera crew consists of homeschooled 8-year-olds with no social skills whatsoever. All footage is inexplicably vertical. The main villain appears. He is some dude from a Wendy's drive-thru. He reads directly from the script. All churches are femboy hooters now. The camera abruptly zooms in to President Dave. He clutches his Bible. It is very large. Kevin Sorbo appears. He is also very large. He is a deepfake because they could not afford him anymore. Every few frames, he is replaced by Mike Pence. The guy from Wendy's turns into a PlayStation 1 polygon monstrosity. His name is Senator Lucifer McAtheist. He declares in a completely different voice, "The Bible is transgender now." The Tesla battery reignites in the background. The cardboard White House collapses. President Dave appears. A bald eagle lands on his shoulder. It is crying. Dave is also crying. Nobody knows why. The eagle starts speaking in tongues. It does not stop. The jury is CGI. The jury consists of a man with 4 arms, a low-poly recreation of Borat, a JPEG of Ted Cruz, a ventriloquist dummy in a MAGA hat, but I repeat myself, an animatronic Chick-fil-A sandwich. It bursts into flames. And finally, the unreleased Chuck Tingle game. The judge is still Jeanine Pirro. She is real. The cardboard White House collapses again. The CGI juror with 4 arms starts levitating. It is disconcerting. The verdict is reached. God wins. Senator Lucifer McAtheist bursts into flames. He was the devil. The Newsboys appear, except they are actually just 7 Jeanine Pirros in different wigs green-screened together. There is blackface. The song is terrible. Deepfake Kevin Sorbo appears again. Nobody knows why. He just stands there. It is disconcerting. The White House collapses again. Roll credits. I am the dog who caught the car. I set out to do the ultimate, definitive thematic breakdown and rebuttal to a series that almost no one in their right mind takes seriously in the first place. I have subjected my tired eyes to 8 hours of the most godforsaken films in the history of cinema. I have spent somewhere around 30 hours writing it. I have subjected my poor wife to all of this. She is inconsolable as anyone of dignity should be, but I'm not. I set out to say something, and over 20,000 words, I did. I said a whole lot. Now it's over, and I don't know what to do with my life. The 7 of you that have made it all the way here are quite honestly completely insane, and I love you for it. I am grateful you took this terrible journey with me, at least in part. We belong to something now. We have become something greater than ourselves, observers of the deepest of human mysteries and their possible answers. Mysteries like, why does this series exist, and will I ever dream again? The answers are, respectively, I still don't know, and probably not. I have staked my claim to the ownership of God's Not Dead among YouTubers. It belongs to me. This is mine now. Big Joel, Pat, Emma Thorne, Nick D'Aramio, Wisecrack, Legal Eagle. People I love. People I respect. People I fear. You have all lost. I make no apologies. Requiem for David A.R. White. I have seen the light, not the light of divine revelation, but the glow of David A.R. White's unrelenting, burning sense of self-belief. You see, from the very beginning, David A.R. White was reaching for something greater, a cinematic kingdom, a higher purpose, but as with all visionaries, the sun burns hot indeed. After finishing this text while recording it, I realized something very important that I had left out. You see, on the first watch of God's Not Dead 3, I was blinded by David A.R. White's astonishing ego and totally unwarranted self-importance, but then I realized something else about it. It ended up being the best of the first 4 movies, and for exactly the same reasons, I thought it was the worst on my initial watch. Let me explain. God's Not Dead 1 is a straightforward David versus Goliath thing, but in the stupidest way possible. There are genuine moments, but there is no nuance whatsoever. God's Not Dead 2 cranks the nuance, but it was some big silly and the plot didn't even matter at all. Neither did Sabrina. God's Not Dead 3 broke from this tradition in a big way. Yes, it certainly had a lot of big silly and big stupid in it as well. The plot is quite obviously nonsense. Its attempt to be more cinematic utterly failed because it used the form without the function. Most of the movie is spent on David A.R. White going between how awesome he is and how sad he is. And it is in these moments where the gold emerges. I know this is going to sound crazy. Everything sounds crazy anymore, but hear me out. The conflict in God's Not Dead 3 actually makes sense. Not about the church itself, but the human conflicts. The ongoing conflict between Dave and his brother ends up being actually impactful. It is the thing I remember most fondly from the whole series, which I know is not saying a lot. Dave's brother Pierce is an atheist and left-wing social justice lawyer. In one scene, they're arguing in the kitchen over who left who, and honestly, this is actually relatable for me. It's not specifically about religion, but religion plays a big part. Pierce feels rejected because he questioned, and when he questioned, he felt he had no option but to leave it all behind. Dave loved Pierce and felt abandoned by him. He was left with the burden of their aging parents, now deceased. He felt like his brother was ashamed of his family and afraid to confront the seriousness of their lives and their beliefs. This is real. This is raw, and it's relatable. I had almost the same experience with family members after I left our small town feeling like I had to go. The scene after they cut down the tree is also really nice because it does something unexpected. It gives Pierce space to be confident in who he is. Dave has a hard time believing that Pierce really feels what he does about things, but he comes to the understanding that Pierce genuinely feels what he does. Pierce is allowed something rare in this series, the benefit of being real. If I'm rating this series out of 5, it goes something like this. God's Not Dead 1 gets 1.5 stars. God's Not Dead 2 gets 2 stars. God's Not Dead 3 gets 2.5 stars. God's Not Dead 4 gets 1 star. It is by far the worst. God's Not Dead 5 gets 2.7 stars. And this probably sounds curious. Why does the 5th one get the highest rating of all if the subplots of the 3rd one were so meaningful? And the answer is simply that God's Not Dead 5, as I've said before, embraces what it is. It doesn't shy away from the full-throated defense of Christian nationalism, even if it rejects that term. I can admire that. I like it when people are honest with me. Almost everything is bad about it, but it's bad in a way that I found vaguely enjoyable. It has a solid, consistent plot and sticks to it. It has the expected twists and turns and shies away from nuance, but doesn't entirely abandon the idea. It isn't filmed in the worst way imaginable, although you can definitely tell the budget was stretched thin by this point. So let's return to the star of our discourse, David A.R. White. I think I was too harsh on him, and no, that isn't a joke. It was really fun to make fun of him for taking over the series, and I'm not going to take that back. He did totally do that just to satisfy his ego, but he also ended up sort of making the series better in the process, at least assuming he was creatively involved, because the 2 best out of the 5 movies are those led by him. I don't know what this ultimately says about him as a person. I assume that if he was as creatively involved as I would imagine, he is probably a more nuanced person than you would first assume from watching this series. You'd probably assume that he is a full-throated MAGA warrior and nothing more. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the movie shied away from that vibe for the most part under his tutelage. Basically, I think David A.R. White might actually see himself as a bridge builder, and to the extent that I did successfully spot bridges in these films, maybe he is right about that. It's not perfect, but at least it seems like he is reaching out. We need more of that. In other words, David is the Icarus of Christian cinema, flying too high for us mere mortals to comprehend before crashing face first into the ocean of low IMDb ratings. But if there is a God, I hope that God will bless David with a long career and long life. We need this man. We just didn't know it yet.